Hi, Misha here, and I've started covering these 1,100 scale diecast models from Eaglemoss. It's in their Warship collection. Now, this collection was released in Japan, but it has been imported in the US and is available at quite a few places. This particular one came from Aikens. I've also picked them up from 250ships.com and even a few from Flying Mule and Diecast Supermart. I kind of wish Pete's had some, but he just doesn't do the cheaper models. He's too good for them. I understand completely. It's the same way with firearms when I'm doing them. The cheap ones, the profit, even if percentage-wise, in actual terms, is just hard. Because these are pretty good little values. I did an unboxing video of a different Russian warship. These are about, on the low end, $22 for the clamshell only ones, up to $25 and $29 for the ones that have the full box and booklet. Pretty nice models. I did kind of an initial review in that unboxing, talked a little bit about them. They come with the stand, they come with the booklet. They have quite a few details. They're just a little too small to have moving turrets, but oh well. So that's about the model review. Really, in this video, we're going to talk about Russian history. Wacky Russian history. And this isn't going to be a complete one. This is just going to be my commentary and kind of fun thoughts, because Russian history is so interesting. And if you have a dark, kind of weird sense of humor, it's extremely entertaining. With that out of the way, I present to you the Gangut Dreadnought battleship, also sometimes known as the Sevastopol class, other times the Gangut-class. This was Russia's first dreadnought, and in some respects really its only. The Russian Navy really wasn't a factor in the 20th century, not a major one. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. The Ruso-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. The Japanese absolutely dominated Russia at the sea, capturing Vladivostok. There was the story of the whole Second Fleet. Not only did Japan damage or destroy quite a bit of the Russian Navy, they actually captured quite a bit of it too. While this actually propelled Japan to becoming a naval power, it really kind of brought Russia's position, which had been well respected since the time of Peter the Great as a navy, into sharp contrast and deep questions. So 1905, 1906, the Navy was examined and found extremely wanting. A lot of leadership was questioned, their positions, their tactics. Also, the ships that Russia had were already kind of looking outdated, and this was before HMS Dreadnought launched. And even on the sailors' end, the training was very poor. The conscripts came from locked-in cities and places. Most of them had never seen the sea before. Morale was low. Conditions were harsh. It was a shit environment. There's no other way to put it. Of course, at this time, we're still under the Tsarist regime. And they started to clean house. A lot of the old conservative, crusty people in the Navy were forced to retire. Of course, a lot of the really good people in the Navy didn't make it back from the war. They were reevaluating their tactics, and then by 1906 they were talking about getting into a modern battleship. Of course, with Dreadnought, they wanted one of those. Give me one of those Dreadnoughts. But it took a long time to get there. the Duma was more interested in restructuring and modernizing the army, which, to be fair, for Russia, considering how few warm water ports they have, makes sense. So funding was lacking. Nevertheless, the Navy did kind of update their requirements in 1907 after Dreadnought, and was seriously looking at a design from Vickers in England, who, to be fair, England had been building ships for Japan too. It was kind of a common thing. It was a 22,000-ton warship with 12 12-inch guns and a nominal top speed of around 22 knots on paper. And the Navy actually liked this design and was happy to order some from Vickers. But the Russian population kind of whipped into a frenzy. It became a political thing. Russia's a political thing, especially in Tsarist times. And there was a perception that Britain's ships that they had built and worked with Russia on in the past weren't living up. Long story short, it was announced on December 31st, 1907, that an international competition would be held. They would be taking design proposals. You know, they had to qualify with the basic requirements from the Navy, but it was going to be open to all comers, and the design had to be submitted by March 12 of 1908. So they had about 2.5 months. And a lot of companies responded. Actually, over a dozen companies submitted designs, and over 50 designs were submitted. Oh, and one other thing. They said, no matter what, even if we buy a foreign design, we're going to build it in Russia. No more foreign assembly. Not that Russia's ship industry was really up to it, had experience with modern dreadnoughts, but never mind that. Keep it at home. You know, national pride, all that. Well, the board looked at the designs and really liked a German one from Blum and Voss. Seemed to meet all their requirements, and they were ready to go. And then France stepped in and said, no. So why did France care? Why did they have the power? Well, because France had been working with Russia to help them modernize since the late 19th century. Not just their military, but things like their railroads, but also their military. For example, some of the first Mosin Nagant rifles, you all know those, the M91, were built in France for Russia. So France had loaned Russia part of the money that they were going to use to buy the design. And the French did not want this money going into German coffers. So a runner-up design was kind of picked instead from the Baltic shipworks in Russia. It wasn't quite what they needed, but they gave them a little more time to kind of work on it. And the Baltic company actually approached John Brown in England to help them kind of finalize and figure things out, because again, the British were the key ship makers at this point. So a finalized design was submitted and approved, and they were going to order 4 ships, and they actually had a laying down ceremony in June of 1909, and promptly nothing happened, because while the Duma had basically approved the new ships, what they hadn't approved were the rubles to build them with. So that summer, nothing happened. Finally, in September, work started to begin, but it was very slow, because again, very little money. In fact, the shipyards ended up having to fork out quite a bit of their own cash for the design. What about that German design? Well, they kind of already selected it during the trials, and having flashbacks of the whole Nagant situation earlier, they went ahead and bought it and promptly did nothing with it. But it was to try to keep the German, because otherwise they'd call foul in the trials, and yeah, so they did buy it, but they never used it. What they did use was this, what will become the Sevastopol or the Gangut-class. It is nominally around 24,000 tons. It has 12-inch guns and a very traditional turret arrangement. It also has 16 4.7-inch secondary guns, encasements, not in turrets. It has 4 torpedo tubes, because those are useful, and 1 anti-aircraft gun. Which, okay, in 1909, I guess, you know. One thing the Admiralty was really interested in was having a ship at least capable of 23 knots. This was because the German fleet at the time had a top speed, considering everything, of around 21.5 knots. So they wanted to be able to outsail the Germans. Now, originally they were going to use old-fashioned large boilers. Easy to clean, easy to maintain, easy to build. But they really didn't have the power to get the ship of this weight up to the speed. So through some more political and whatnot trickery, they were able to get the newer style small tube boilers approved, some more power. Even though these were more difficult to build, more difficult to maintain, they did provide a top speed. And actually, during trials, these ships would get up to about 24 knots, although when fully loaded out, that would drop down to 23 or even 22.5, depending on, But still, they got what they wanted, more or less. She is just under 600 foot long and has a crew of around 1,150 officers and men. No aircraft facilities. Of course, no radar facilities, because we're talking about 1910, 1911 at this point. The turret situation is quite interesting. Superfiring turrets were a thing by now, and the Russian Admiralty wanted nothing to do with them, really. They liked the traditional idea of a broadside, and they were also not sold on the super turret notion. They were afraid the blast from the higher up turret would impact the lower turret and other things. This did have some advantages. For one, it spread the turrets out more, meaning less chance of all getting knocked out. It also spread out the ammunition magazines, meaning less chance of a huge detonation. It gave the ships better balance and stability because the weight was more evenly spread out. It gave the ship a lower silhouette on the horizon. And, kind of specific to Russia, it made it less vulnerable to icing, because even if, some part of your deck is iced up, you have 4 turrets instead of, 2 basic locations. So you can kind of see where that would come from. Now, the downsides. Having your turrets spread out like this and having all these extra magazines means all the equipment is spread out throughout the ship, meaning the engine rooms and such had to be kind of fitted in between them. It also meant it was heavier than really you probably would want. And obviously you have a good broadside, but head on you can only bring 4 guns at a time to bear. Also, the fact that she was heavier because of the whole design meant that some of the secondary guns were pretty ineffective, and it's said that this was a very wet design. No, that doesn't mean they got excited. That means that they were riding low in the water. So in some ways it was a good seakeeper, in other ways probably a miserable ship to be on board. Plus it's the Russian Navy, so blah. Finally, in May of 1911, the Duma allocated enough funding to really finish up the 4 ships, and so work got underway. And when the Great War began in 1914, these were rushed out of the shipyards and rushed through abbreviated trials. And they would officially enter the fleet in December of 1914, although in January through March they were still tinkering with getting the turrets, the guns, the firing systems right, because that was kind of one of the last components that was done. Even when the hull was being built, they still didn't have a finalized turret design, so that kind of came last. Luckily, they didn't really have a lot of problems with the guns. They're 12-inch guns, very, very conventional by World War I standards. Now, she was known for being weakly armored or having kind of noticeable soft spots in her armor, weak points, which could have been exploited, but in the end, kind of didn't end up mattering. All 4 ships in the class were named after famous Russian battles. You had, of course, Gangut. You had Sevastopol. You had Petropavlovsk. And you had Poltava. And since they were pretty much started at the same time, they more or less were finished at the same time. Close enough that it didn't matter. And by 1915, they were ready for full-scale deployment. They joined the fleet, and they were assigned to the Baltic. One of their first duties was to kind of guard the entrance to the Gulf of Finland. Finland at this time, of course, being nominally under Russian rule, although not for much longer. But the German High Seas Fleet never tried to get to Finland, so they were really left with nothing to do but train, which in the beginning was probably good. It also gave them a chance to kind of work out the new systems. Even though this was a brand new dreadnought for Russia, it was at most a 1.5 dreadnought at a time when second generation dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts were a thing, so it wasn't exactly the most modern ship, but it wasn't laughably obsolescent either. But they had their dreadnoughts. So with nothing else to do, these were assigned to do various escort missions for things like mine-laying operations. And they would kind of sortie into the Baltic from time to time, more or less on training cruises and just to kind of poke around. And during some of those mining missions, pretty much everyone would take a turn at running ashore. But little to no damage was done on the 3 ships. The only one that really was damaged was Sevastopol through the running aground. And that's pretty much their wartime career in World War I. Actually, after Finland fought for her independence and had a treaty with Russia, one of the terms of the treaty was that by March of 1918, the Russians had to evacuate their naval base in Helsinki, and if they didn't, the Finns could seize whatever was left. The problem was, at this time, the Gulf of Finland was still more or less frozen over. And this kind of resulted in the semi-famous ice voyage, where the Ganguts plowed the way out of ice and got out into open water and would return to Russia. And that's where things get quite interesting, because 1918, Russia, revolution, and all kinds of fun stuff. So the Ganguts' transition over to being part of the Soviet Navy all began because of macaroni. On November the 1st, 1916, there was a minor mutiny on board the Gangut herself when the crew didn't get the food they wanted. They had done a recalling operation, and for whatever Russian reason, the traditional meal to be served after such hard and nasty work was of meat and macaroni. Okay, macaroni, you understand. Meat, that's just a thing in Russia. What kind of meat? Meat. It's meat. Yeah. Anyway, it's kind of a half joke, but it was a thing. It really does show the deteriorating morale at the end of the year because these ships really weren't doing much. And then, of course, in February 1917, there was a revolution in Russia. Now, this was when Russia would, again, not for the first time, not for the last time, flirt with democracy. And news of this would reach the Baltic Fleet that March, and the 4 battleships would quickly kick in with the revolution. Of course, this government would not last long, and then in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks would seize power, at least begin to, meaning that these would fall under Bolshevik control. By 1918, most of the ships were just laid up. They didn't have enough manpower to run them, or really any idea. They had other things going on. Russia had sued for peace in the war and was out of the war anyway. One ship that was kept around was Petropavlovsk, who actually was used in 1919 to support Red Army forces against the White Russians and also against the Royal Navy. So she saw a little action there. But then in 1921, she joined the Kronstadt Rebellion against the Bolsheviks, along with her sister ship, Sevastopol. But this didn't last long, and it earned them new names. If I remember correctly, I think Sevastopol was Marat. I'm trying to remember. The names get very confusing here with these ships because they go back and forth. Trying to rack my brain. Yeah, well. They became Marat and Paris Commune. I believe Paris Commune was, Paris Commune was Sevastopol, and Petropavlovsk would become Marat. And, that's kind of what happened. Also in 1919, in November, the Poltava would have a major boiler room fire, which would spread throughout pretty much the entire ship, at least the engine compartments and whatnot, doing major fire damage. And so she would basically be a Hulk. Now, they did think about doing something with her in the 1920s and 30s. Several plans and yada yada. Finally, they just gave up on it in 1935. They did use her as a floating barracks Hulk. Basically, they just stripped her for parts. And she was officially stricken in 1940. The other ships, Gangut would be renamed the October Revolution in 1925. And just because, they would go ahead and rename Poltava in 1926 Frunze. Because why not rename a Hulk? The Soviets love renaming things. Now, one good thing, they did rebuild the ships throughout the 20s. The new Marat was one of the first, along with Paris Commune, and one of the last ones, or at least the second to last to be redone, was October Revolution in the 1930s. All this initial work was done by 1938, although the ships would go in for new anti-aircraft and other upgrades throughout the whole period. During the Ruso-Finnish War, the Winter War, the Gangut types would be used to bombard the Finnish coastal defenses in December of 1939, but once winter set in, the waters were frozen over and they could no longer be used. So that was pretty much their only contribution. Of course, World War II. Germans, Operation Barbarossa, you know the drill. But it wasn't until September of 1941 that these started to fire shells in anger at the Germans. They would support ground troops, so on and so forth. Between September and November of 1941, pretty much all of the remaining ships would be damaged to some degree, especially Gangut October here. Marat would be hit by bombs. Actually, Marat would end up being essentially sunk. She'd have her bow blown off. She would be refloated, though, and kind of turned into a mobile gun, or not really mobile, I guess floating was the word I'm looking for, gun platform, supporting actions to defend Leningrad and help alleviate the siege. Likewise, the Hulk, Frunze, would be towed nearby and used as kind of a mooring station and depot for small coastal ships. So getting some more use out of that Hulk. And they would be used to support troops after being repaired and refurbished and refit throughout World War II. In 1943, Sevastopol would regain her original name, as would Petropavlovsk. I guess they decided that the 1921 names weren't edgy enough anymore. Again, the Soviets love renaming things. October Revolution kept her name because I guess that's a good one. And by this point, Frunze was pretty much not a ship anymore. It didn't really matter. Gangut-October is kind of interesting because on June 9th, 1944, she would be the last Russian/Soviet warship, battleship, to fire her guns in combat in anger. Earlier, Sevastopol had already fired her last rounds in anger. Following World War II, of course, these ships are over 30 years old, but they've been rebuilt, and 2 were still on the Naval Registry, and they were in active service throughout the late 40s. And then in 1954, they were declared school training ships, which they would serve as for a little while. And then in 1956, they would be stricken from the registry and scheduled to be cut apart, scrapped, salvaged, what have you. And this would go for a few years. It's a very abbreviated history, but it really goes to just show you that Russia got their use out of these, but they never really were in a naval ship-on-ship engagement, which is why that potential armor weakness was never tested in combat and never caused sailors to lose their lives, because these were essentially mobile, seagoing artillery platforms. I suppose, since they were kind of designed mostly for broadsides, that makes sense. As I said, they did have their anti-aircraft batteries upgraded, especially Marat, once she became a floating platform. But yeah, Soviet history, especially early on, it was all about names. It wasn't what you had, it's what you called what you had. They put a lot more emphasis on the name of a thing than what it was. Essentially, it was political correctness, if that makes sense, which focuses more on the minutiae and not the general spirit. The thing is, it's hard to really get upset about the Russian Revolution because the Tsarist regime had always been very tyrannical, and by the 20th century was also quite ineffective and even incompetent. And they did try democracy for all of half a year. I don't know, Russian democracy just never really worked out. But the Ganguts, the Sevastopol class, are interesting because they were designed deep in the still imperial days, well before World War I. They were around during World War I. They were in World War II, and they even served a decade into the Cold War. Not bad. A 40-plus year service for at least 2 out of the 4. And they were really among Russia's first and last true battleships. Obviously, Russia would focus more on submarines and coastal defense vessels after the revolution. They never really tried to rebuild a long-range blue water navy, which is probably good because Russia has never exactly had an abundance of warm water ports. They did use these in the Black Sea, at least they used Marat, and that's been one place, but that has its own challenges, and it's a different area from, of course, the ocean itself. But yeah, I just couldn't resist talking about Russian history a wee bit. Again, I've glossed over things, and I don't read from a teleprompter, I just kind of ramble. But yeah, I really do like these Eagle Moss models for what they cost. You get a lot of bang for your buck, I think. They only do 2 Russian ships. They do the pre-dreadnought Borodino, and they do this. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to leave them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.